Good morning for participants in the Asian area. Good afternoon or good evening for friends in European countries, Africa, and in North and South American region. Thank you for coming to our session. I'm Fumiaki Kubo, the president of the National Defense Academy of Japan, as well as a senior adjunct fellow of Japan Institute for International Affairs, or JIA. I'm a moderator of this session. Our theme here is US-China competition and the Indo-Pacific region. Obviously, the relationship between the United States and China is one of the most important factors to understand the international politics of East Asia. But there are, of course, other factors which include how China, US, and perhaps Japan are perceived in the Indo-Pacific region, how Russia's invasion of Ukraine a year ago cast a shadow over the international politics of this region, how Japan's change in its national security policy is perceived. These are just the few illustrations. As is written in the outline of this session in the program, the competitive and the confrontational US-China relationship has increased its tenseness in 2022, especially over Taiwan. But needless to say, there are many more actors that we should and we must count in, such as South Korea, Singapore, and many ASEAN countries, and of course, Japan. It seems that there's some degree of unwillingness or hesitancy on the part of many countries in this region to come out and side with either the United States or China explicitly. Some of our panelists might like to address this issue and make sense of that too. Now, we have really distinguished panelists from various parts of the Indo-Pacific region. I just briefly introduce their name and affiliation in the order of speaking. Much more detailed bio is available in the program on the website of the JIA. The first speaker is Ms. Susan Thornton, the director of the Forum in Asia-Pacific Security National Committee on American Foreign Policy. The second panelist is Ambassador Bilahari Kaushkan, chairman of the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore. We just met in my office last year, and nice to see you again here. The third panelist is from South Korea, Mr. Lee Chon-myeon, president of the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security, Korea National Diplomatic Academy. The fourth panelist is Professor Fan Shimin, Executive Vice Dean of Yenching Academy, Peking University. The last but not least important speaker is Professor Tsutomu Kikuchi, Professor Emeritus of Aoyama Gakuin University and Senior Adjunct Fellow at JIA. I have asked each panelist to make an initial remark, which should be within 5 minutes. Then we'll do some discussion among panelists. In the last part of the session, I'd like to take questions, comments from the audience. I would appreciate it very much if the participants give us questions and comments. Now, without further ado, I'd like to start the session. Ms. Thornton, could you start?
Certainly. Thank you so much, President Kubo. It's such a privilege to be with all of my fellow panelists and with JIIA for this really timely conference. I wanted to take a step back at the beginning of my remarks and just note that the region today faces a very different situation than we imagined we would be facing during the unipolar post-Cold War moment. And of course, that unipolarity was never sustainable. And US foreign policy watchers in the 1990s even talked about how we would make a transition from this unipolar moment to a so-called multipolar world. But I think the opportunity to prepare for that transition was unfortunately lost amid this global war on terror that we had in the first decade of this century, and then the global financial crisis, which we had in the second decade of this century, and a number of other crises that caused us to have to constantly be reacting. I think that history is not irrelevant to where the US and China find themselves now in their current competition slash rivalry slash burgeoning adversity. And I think there was an attempt to try to reform the system, to make some kind of a transition and to spread the burden of global public goods during the Obama administration, but it was too little, too late, and these other crises that I mentioned, I'm afraid, intervened. So today, when we are meant as a global community to be focusing on our economic and societal reforms and on our combating climate change and other environmental hazards, instead we're focused, of course, on this resurgent great power adversity, which is going to, I believe, dominate the global agenda for at least the next decade. US strategy is obviously to tame and to weaken Russia's and China's ambitions and power through the ongoing competition and the confrontation that we see. And in the case of Russia's war in Ukraine, which I was asked to talk about, it appears as though the war and the sanctions are going to endure for quite some time. I think they will certainly likely weaken Russia, but probably not break Putin. And I think the US will sustain its support for Ukraine. But there are obviously a lot of questions as to how long that can go on and how long the conflict will last. I think the most important effects for the Asia Pacific from that conflict are going to be in the disruption of commodity markets, especially energy, and also the disruption of the international system, which in the context of the UN Security Council is currently non-functional, and we will not see, I don't think, a smooth operation of our normal functioning of the international institutions while this conflict is continuing. So the Ukraine war will also affect and has already affected the US competition with China, which is going to affect the Asia Pacific region. Ukraine has brought a Taiwan conflict to the front of everybody's mind, and certainly there is a lot of discussion and headlines and consciousness now about potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and the question of the cross-strait issue has become extremely militarized and is now dominating US-China tensions. As the US intensifies its competition with China, while also supporting the Ukrainians against Russia, I think it is understandable and clearly prudent for Japan and for other countries in the region to elevate their defense profiles and to try to strengthen their self-reliance and their resilience. And you talked about the response of other countries in the region to the US-China rivalry. I think when many countries look out at this rivalry and see what may be in the offing, they are also inclined to both sort of batten down the hatches, but also strengthen themselves and not stick their head up, which is how we get the phenomenon that you mentioned of countries not wanting to step out and take sides. They don't see what kind of benefit they're going to get from involving themselves deeply in this burgeoning conflict. I think indeed we see many countries taking this approach in the security and the economic realms. And I know this is a discussion about politics and security, but I think that countries are going to try to insulate themselves from the uncertainty and sense of foreboding that they feel about geopolitics and geoeconomics currently. So, of course, the casualty in all this is the agenda that we were meant to be working on, which is developing our economies, improving our societies, and certainly combating climate change and trying to prevent planetary warming. But I think we are going to see probably a slight de-emphasis or delay, unfortunately, in a lot of that while we focus our attention for the coming years on this issue of geopolitical and geoeconomic, very tough competition. I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for giving us good insights to starting the discussion. Then, Ambassador Koskan, could you flow?
Thank you. I had prepared some remarks, but having listened to your opening remarks and to Susan, I think I will disregard them and take a different track.
No problem.
You asked a question, which is a very important question. Why countries in the region, and I will speak mainly about Southeast Asia, seem unwilling to take sides? I think the reason is twofold. We all are confronted with two very stark realities. First, we all have to deal with both the US and China. This is not a choice. And in fact, there is a greater appreciation that dealing with both simultaneously is a necessary condition of dealing with either effectively. Secondly, the other harsh reality we face is that I know of no country, even the closest US ally or the most dependent on China economically, that is without concerns about one aspect or the other of both Chinese and American behavior. The concerns are not the same, and they are not held with the same intensity, but nonetheless, they exist. You put these two facts together, and the conclusion most countries come to is not choosing sides is probably the wrong way of describing the situation. The conclusion they come to is to preserve as much strategic autonomy as they can, so as to be able to pursue their interests as they define them as best they can. And sometimes those interests may take us in a direction that appears to be tilting towards the Chinese, or appears to be tilting towards the United States, or Japan, or India, or for that matter, Botswana, or Africa, or something. But it's always our interest. So I think, the fact you frame the question that way, I think betrays a cast of mind that is fundamentally mistaken. It is not a question of taking sides. It's a question of understanding your own interests and preserving the autonomy to pursue them no matter where they may take you. Now, if I have any more time, and I think I've got a couple of minutes, let me just focus on one aspect of this, and that is what I would like to call perhaps the ideological aspect of US-China competition, the battle for hearts and minds. Speaking in Japan, I don't have to remind the audience about who Akita Kurosawa was, or his famous film, Rashomon, right? And I think that's an important point, because Rashomon is about how one event can appear very different from different perspectives, right? I think we all agree that the rules-based order is very important to all of us, and that includes China, by the way. But all of us have different ideas of what the rules-based order means. That phrase is a Rashomon term. It means different things. Just because we use the same words doesn't mean that we always mean the same things by those same words or place the same emphasis on the same things. I think that's important because of the connections that have been drawn, rightly or wrongly, between the war in Ukraine and US-China competition. To me, great power competition is a normal state of affairs. The unipolar moment that Susan mentioned was a short and also abnormal state of affairs. And now we are returning to normalcy. Yesterday evening, I spoke here, and I reminded the audience that if you take great power competition, which sometimes becomes conflict, as a normal state of affairs, the war in Ukraine is only unique because it's being fought in Europe and because nuclear weapon states are either directly or indirectly involved. Or to put it more starkly, look, the war in Ukraine is unique only because for the first time in a long time, white people are killing each other with the help of other white people. If you ask people in Africa, if you ask people in the Middle East, you ask people in Latin America, war, conflict, sometimes caused by great power interventions or by proxies of great powers, is a continuous reality that they have had to live with. And that's important to remember because it is the reason, I think, why some of the Western pronouncements on the war in Ukraine are received with a great deal of skepticism, if not ambivalence in the global South. I think you should not underestimate the degree of skepticism or the tenuousness of support for the Western position on Ukraine in the global South. My country, which has taken a strong stance against aggression against Ukraine, is a bit of an outlier in Southeast Asia. That's important because Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has said explicitly the US wants to use Ukraine to weaken Russia so it can never invade another country again. And that's very good. But I think what he did not say, but I think to me at least is clear enough, that one of the reasons the US is taken the stance it has in Russia is to make Ukraine an object lesson for China. And I think there is a battle for the hearts and minds going on in which this undercurrent of ambivalence about some Western positions on Ukraine are being used or being exploited as a weapon by at least the Chinese side in the battle for hearts and minds, especially in Southeast Asia. One last point, and the way it works is something like this. This war is going to be a long war, I think. It's going to last at least another couple of years, if not longer. And it's not going to end in a very definitive peace treaty, probably more likely some kind of armistice. And so the question here is the sustainability of political support for the Western position, which I think is the correct position anyway, personally, over the long term. And here I think, you have to avoid simplistic frameworks. There is a tendency in the United States, in Europe, to present this as a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. But that's too simple. It's too simple, and it doesn't really resonate very strongly in much of the global South, and certainly I don't think it resonates very strongly in Southeast Asia. Why? Because both democracy and authoritarianism, these are protean terms. There are many types of democracies, there are many types of authoritarianism, and it would be a mistake to think that every aspect of Western democracy is regarded with great and unqualified admiration. And it's also wrong to think that every aspect of every type of authoritarianism is rejected by everybody in Southeast Asia. You need a much more differentiated way of looking at the world. It's not a good way. This kind of simplistic framework doesn't bring you support, and it feeds into attempts to confuse the issues in Ukraine with the issues in US-China relations in a way that does not benefit the US or the West generally. I was going to say something about Taiwan because I think Taiwan intersects with this, but I will stop here and continue later.
Thank you very much. Perhaps later. Thank you very much for giving us very stimulating food for thought. Now we would like to turn to the third panelist from Republic of Korea, President Lee Chon-min, please.
Thank you, moderator. I'm very honored to be here, and I really thank you for your invitation. And I want to talk a little bit about the Indo-Pacific strategy or vision from the perspective of U.S.-China competition or rivalry. As you know, many countries have had their own Indo-Pacific strategies or visions announced. Like some other concepts in the international relations, there is no agreed or commonly shared definition for the Indo-Pacific vision or strategy. And when we talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy or vision, we normally have different focuses or priorities in mind, depending on our different perspectives about the region. Some may have China in mind, some others may have ASEAN and India in mind, and yet some others outside the region may have Asia in general in mind. Having said that, let me now briefly compare the Indo-Pacific strategies or visions of US, Japan, and Korea. In terms of scope of coverage, the US strategy focuses on, quote, every corner of the region from Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia to South Asia and Oceania, including the Pacific Islands, unquote. As everyone knows, one of the main focuses of US strategy is China, of course, but it discusses also on Korea, Japan, and ASEAN, and even touches upon North Korea in the context of Indo-Pacific security. The US strategy also says that the intensifying American focus on the Indo-Pacific can be attributed in part to the fact that the region faces mounting challenges, especially from China. The Indo-Pacific strategies of Korea and Japan covers a broad range of countries, and they even include African countries different from the US strategy. But despite its broad coverage and the status of Japan as one of the founding fathers of the concept, Japan's vision itself does not say much about China, at least not on the surface. I know that Japan's national security strategy has defined China as one of the biggest strategic challenges. Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision suggests the attempts to change the status quo as one of the various challenges that the Indo-Pacific region faces, and does not go further in terms of China. But I think that this kind of intentional silence, together with the overarching theme of rule-based order mentioned in Japan's vision, tells much about the nature of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. It should be also noted here that Japan's vision of FOIP, as is shown in the open source of Japan's foreign ministry, at least, does not include a perspective or position with respect to the relations with Korea. And it seems that its Indo-Pacific vision is a little bit separate from its strategy or stance against DPRK. Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, announced last November by Korean President Yoon and in December by the Korean Foreign Minister, clearly sets out its position on its relationship with Japan and China. It says that, quote, with our closest neighbor Japan, we will seek a forward-looking partnership that supports our common interests and values. Improved relations with Japan is essential for fostering cooperation and solidarity among like-minded countries. We are thus continuing our diplomatic efforts to restore mutual trust and advance relations, unquote. Korea's strategy also defines the trilateral cooperation with the US and Japan as a useful platform for cooperation to address nearly every issue in the region, confirming the commitment not to target nor exclude any specific nation and describing China as a key partner for achieving prosperity and peace in the region. It clearly asks for a sounder and more mature relationship with China as Korea pursues shared interest based on mutual respect and reciprocity, guided by international norms and rules. Finally, let me briefly explain two basic orientations that Korea's strategy is going for. First, it aims to develop a comprehensive regional cooperation framework and wants to diversify and broaden Korea's attention from the narrow scope of Korean Peninsula issues. In this sense, it is connected with the new administration's initiative for Global Pivotal State, so-called GPS, and tries to overcome the limits of the former Korean administration's New South policy, which focused mainly on some certain specific areas, including ASEAN. Second, it expresses Korea's intention to expand its own contribution and responsibility to the Indo-Pacific, not only in terms of economy, trade, and development cooperation, but also in terms of security. Having compared three different visions of US, Japan, and Korea, I would like to emphasize the need to coordinate those visions among them and to allow the necessary strategic space to each other by strengthening their bilateral and trilateral relations. Living in an era of US-China competition or rivalry or whatever is not just a problem of balancing between the two, but it is also deeply connected, at least in our case, deeply connected with our own values, culture, and way of thinking. And it is thus a complex multi-order equation rather than a linear equation. I think that solidarity among those countries which share vision is an essential tool for solving this kind of difficult equation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee Chun-min, and thank you for turning our attention to the differences of definition of Indo-Pacific strategy or vision among three countries, US, Japan, and ROK. Now, I'd like to ask Professor Pham Chi Minh to make your case. Floor is yours, please.
Okay. Thank you, President Kubo, and good morning or good evening, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be invited to this year's Tokyo Global Dialogue, especially when, as some of you mentioned, uncertainties and tensions are on the rise in our region. So I do appreciate the opportunity you offered and would like to share some very short personal observations. First, some assessment on current China-US relations. I think we have already identified some of the tough security challenges in our region, especially between China and the United States. Okay, and I think I agree that China-US relations in most of 2022 continued to be on the more confrontational track, even though leaders from both sides tried to manage the bilateral relationship to avoid unexpected clashes. But I see very extensive and fundamental differences or disputes between Beijing and Washington, not only about hard power race on ships or warships, but also over soft power competition, the values and the ways of governing a nation and the world. So I'm not optimistic about China-US relations in the short run. And my second point is about the controversy over regional and the world order. Both Chinese and American governments advocate rule-based international order, as we already mentioned, but their rules are actually not the same. Chinese government does not agree on the universality of US-led liberal international order and criticize American unilateralism and alliance politics, which in China are seen as exclusive and divisive. Chinese leaders repeatedly criticize the Cold War mentality. I think when they said Cold War mentality, they refer to this ideological clashes, military alliances, economic decoupling, emerging economic blocs, etc. Chinese official position is to stick to UN-centered multilateralism, international law, and to prevent and to promote democratization of international relations, which means less US or Western dominance in world affairs. China is very vigilant to see the strengthening of the Quad cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region, especially at the expense of China's security interest. So I do worry about the emerging security bloc, which may make regional countries to take sides or to invite escalation of tension or even conflict in our region. And my third point is about the very strong mutual distrust between China and the United States. I especially note the mutual distrust problem in the bilateral relationship. This was raised and discussed by Wang Jisi and Ken Liboso a decade ago. But unfortunately, since then, we only witnessed an even downward trust spiral instead of any improvement. Many Chinese people believe that the United States is playing the security hotspots, including Ukraine and Taiwan, perhaps, to weaken its competitors so that it could maintain superiority and hegemony. The idea that the US is doing everything to divide China territorially, subvert it politically, frustrate it economically, and contain China strategically has only been reinforced in recent years. The talks between the two governments are not helpful enough to ease these suspicions. And the people-to-people exchange were declined or even disrupted a lot during the pandemic. So I think to resume dialogue between China and America is very urgent and necessary matter, not only between China and the United States, maybe also between China and other regional countries. Okay. Finally, I'd like to make a very short comment on Ukraine and Taiwan. I think many people are comparing Ukraine and Taiwan. I think I don't want to make any connection actually between these two problems, but if I have to make any connections between the war in Ukraine and the tension in Taiwan, let me say the war in Ukraine should make all stakeholders related to Taiwan carefully judge and weigh the consequences of any reckless unilateral move and to value the status quo and peace across the Taiwan Strait. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fan Ximin. Thank you for attending this session. I once attended kind of a conference on China at Cornell University, and most of the students are from China, and most of the panelists, except me, were from like Chinese scholars, commentators, and the Chinese Americans, all of whom are a bit unfriendly to United States and Japan. So I understand how it is, and I thank you very much for you to attend this meeting and giving us the chance to exchange ideas. So thank you for waiting. Now it's your turn, Professor Kikuchi.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Kubo. I'm very much pleased to be back to Tokyo Global Dialogue again. So I would begin by sharing my own perspective on the Indo-Pacific regions. I feel we are present at creation. We stand at quite the historical moment, creating a more pluralistic regional order in the Indo-Pacific, where not only big powers like the US and China, but also substantial number of the regional countries could play a quite constructive role for regional affairs. So Indo-Pacific is characterized not only by the rise of China, but also the emergence of substantial number of strong or relatively powerful countries in this part of the world. So those countries are willing and capable to play a constructive role for regional affairs. They are not bystanders. They are not pawns or bystanders of great power politics. They have agencies to play a role. And for example, Japan, beyond traditional economic focused engagement in the regions, recently Japan has been engaged quite actively or geostrategic affairs of these regions. So recent national security strategies and defense strategies further demonstrate Japan's willingness to be engaged actively in the regional strategic affairs. To India, overcoming quite traditional inward-looking postures, now getting confidence in their own futures, and India is now determined to become leading powers regionally and globally. And some of the ASEAN countries, not all ASEAN countries, but some of the ASEAN countries, such as Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, some other countries, they are now discovering their own agencies to play a constructive role in regional affairs and gradually engaged in the game over the future of the Indo-Pacific. So they are not, as I mentioned, not bystander in the big power politics. So Australia now emerging as one of the key Indo-Pacific powers. The Korea, as the previous speaker mentioned, are already, as demonstrated by a recent publication of Indo-Pacific strategies, so Korea is also quite willing to engage in broader Indo-Pacific international relations. So previous Korean government, they argued the peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula will be conducive to broader Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific peace and stability. But now logic is reversed. The broader peace and stability in the broader Asia-Pacific is conducive to peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. It's a big difference. So I think, but this period, process of transition to pluralistic regional order takes time, probably takes a few decades. So our mission, including Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategies, is to push the process ahead without major disruption like a military conflict and so forth. And for this, we need further, enhancement of our respective national governance, national resilience, by taking, on the one hand, self-help, measures like, strengthening our own defense capabilities, and also promoting partnership relation with other like-minded countries. And and I think Indo-Pacific countries have been showing remarkable economic strength, economic development, and thereby strengthening national government. But in the quite good strategic and economic relation. So in the relatively stable relation between big powers and also quite progressive economic globalizations. But now these two conditions is changing. So we need additional measures to enhance our national resilience to respond to changing regional and global situations. And I think, further enhancing national resilience of the Indo-Pacific countries will be contribute to keep U.S. engaged in the Indo-Pacific. So, any, pluralistic, regional orders cannot be realized without U.S. active engagement. This has nothing to do with who occupied the White House. But at the same time, strong national resilience of the Indo-Pacific countries will put some constraint on the U.S. unilateral behavior in these regions. Also, this enhanced national resilience will be conducted to a better relation with China. So we enhanced strong national resilience allow the regional countries stand up to China when China take a defiant behavior against international rules. But at the same time, we could explore the ways that coexist with China in quite productive ways. So I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kikuchi, for your good insight and input as a specialist of Southeastern Asia politics. Now we listen to initial remarks from all panelists, and since we are doing this in downtown Tokyo, and the host is foremost Japan's think tank, I'd like to ask you the same question, which is about Japan. What do you think of the recent Japan's change in its security policy, which is pretty historic by our own standard, but there might be different interpretations depending on where you live, where your perspective, and there might be kind of some strengths but weaknesses. What do you think? And in the same order, I'd like to start with Ms. Thornton, and the Professor Kikuchi will be the last one. So I want you to comment what you express your reaction after listening to the reaction, the comments from all panelists, and what do you think Japan should do, further? So. Professor Thornton, what do you think of the Japan's recent change?
Yeah, well, I spoke a little bit about this in my comments. I mean, I think it's really perfectly understandable that given all of the uncertainty and sort of dangers that are looming out there after we saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then we see tensions flaring in the Taiwan Strait. There seems to be a lot more militarization in the region. And so I think all of these factors combined gave the push to do finally this increase in the sort of defense posture in Japan and the significant changes in the national security strategy, which certainly my government in the United States very much welcomed. This is a direction that we've been sort of hoping Japan would go in for a while. I think it'll be very interesting to see, though, in the long run, if this gives Japan a little bit more free hand or agency in the defense relationship with the United States, how much the U.S. will welcome that. So I think that's a space to watch. But so far, I think this is something that the U.S. has very much welcomed and will help, of course, the U.S. Deal with the defense posture that it feels it needs to keep in the region.
Do you think it was too little, too late?
No, I don't think so. We have a lot of deterrent power in the region, and I don't think it's too little, too late. No.
Okay, thanks, Ambassador Koskin.
Last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, Prime Minister Kishida promised a more proactive Japanese approach towards meeting the regional and international security challenges. And I think this was generally well received by most countries, and certainly was well received by my country. And what we have seen with the new national security strategy, the new defense secretary, new defense approach, is the first steps in fulfilling this promise of a more proactive approach. And I think it's perfectly understandable, it's perfectly necessary. These things were announced by Mr. Kishida, but I think he will not mind if I point out what is obvious, that the foundations were laid by the late Mr. Abe, right? And this is a fundamentally new approach, which will endure over the long term, I think, because it is a response to fundamental changes in the security environment. And those changes are not going away, and therefore the new approach is not going away. And I think Japan is going to play a very important role, increasingly important role. Of course, it will take some time to build those capabilities. It can't be done overnight, but you have taken the first step, and the first step is in the right direction. I think there are three fundamental things that Japan can play. First of all, of course, you are the major US ally in this region, and therefore you keep the US anchored in this region. I agree with you, Professor, that this is going to be a more complex security equation with more actors exercising their agency. But that will have to be built on the foundation of a balance, and the balance must be based on the foundation of the US presence. Secondly, I think the US is a global power. That's a fact. And as a global power, from time to time, the US will have responsibilities in other regions of the world. But Japan is a regional power. And with these enhanced capabilities, I look to Japan to play a bigger role in maintaining the balance to supplement the US at times when the US has other responsibilities elsewhere. Thirdly, with specific regard to Southeast Asia, I think many surveys have shown that Japan is probably ASEAN's most trusted dialogue partner. And that's a great asset. Japan is also, I think, the dialogue partner that best understands Southeast Asia. And therefore, I think Japan has a very important role to play in explaining Southeast Asia to Europe, which is taking a bigger interest to the US. And that's particularly true in regard to what I said in my initial remarks, that this framework of democracy versus authoritarianism is not in Western interest in Southeast Asia. It's just too simplistic. It doesn't provide you support. But we understand these are values that some countries in the West hold very dear, but they are not values that are always going to be very applicable in the context of Southeast Asia. And we look to Japan to temper these instincts in your Western partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, President Lee Chun-myung, please.
Yes. Let me talk about 3 points about the Japan's, sort of change of its security policy. I don't oppose that Japan has to do much greater role in the international society. And I don't have any intention to oppose that kind of very natural theme in international relations. But I think the Japan should keep 3 points in mind in implementing the kind of shift of strategy in terms of security policy. First, it should contribute to regional peace and security. And second, it should duly take into consideration the concerns of neighboring countries, right, to fully accomplish its intended purpose. Without easing the concerns of neighboring countries, it cannot attain the intended purposes And third, I think this is most important. I think it should be consistent with its policy, Japan's policy, in terms of relations with neighboring countries, I mean, including the Japan-Korea relations. So if, I mean, the shift of security policy of Japan meets those three conditions, I mean, nobody will object to I mean, this kind of policy promoted by Japan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It seems that it might be difficult for Japan to ease concerns of a neighbor totally, so that might be a problem. Then I'd like to ask the Professor Huang Ximin, what is your opinion?
Thank you. I think I'm not in a good position to make any comments on Japan's defense policy or security policy. I'm not a Japanese expert, but just some general observations. I think I understand the comments from Susan and from our Singaporean participant, and I also very much understand the concerns raised by Ambassador Lee. I think you can already feel the differences between all these comments. I think first, the change of security policy or the rearmament of Japan is a domestic affair of Japan. And if Japan, the Japanese people believe that the shift of security policy is really in Japan's interest, and that's a Japanese affair. And secondly, as Ambassador Lee said, when Japan changes its security policies or remilitarize itself, it should fully take care of the feelings of the neighboring countries, especially the Chinese and the Korean maybe people. And I think especially the general public in these two countries are still somewhat overshadowed by historical memory. So I think they are very vigilant about Japan's remilitarization or these kind of things. So I think the Japanese government should take good care of these feelings and to do some more explanations to clarify the intentions of these moves. And thirdly, I think if Japan's change of security policy is a constructive move, and no problem. But if Japan said the change of security policy is to defend Taiwan, and that would be a problem in China. And I read, so I think I read some comments on Japan's security change and some comments to connect this change to the situation in Taiwan. So I think if so, that would be a big problem in China. And that's all from me.
Okay, thank you very much for giving us a candid opinion. So, Professor Kikuchi, what do you think of these reactions, and is there things that Japan should be careful or should do?
Thank you. If we look at the broader, Indo-Pacific, I think almost all the countries have engaged in quite active self-help, the measure to improve their own security environment, including increased defense expenditure, and also introducing a more a modern equipment, weapons and system and so forth. In that context, Japan is not exceptions. And also, in case of Japan, if you look back the last several years, especially Prime Minister Abe returned to the office, Japan taking quite number of the bold initiative to strengthen the Japanese defense capability and also Japan's cooperation with the United States. I think we have quite clear recognitions strengthening our own self-help capabilities could contribute to strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance and, keep U.S. engaged not only the defense of Japan, but also security of the Indo-Pacific. And, so I think, as I mentioned in my presentations, our own self-help effort is essential to keep U.S. engaged in the regions. It's an essential condition for regional peace. So now I think, Japan clearly recognize the importance of convince the U.S. government and the peoples how Japan is an important country for the United States. So I'm saying this is a so-called Australianization of Japan's security policies. So Australia is an ally of the United States, same as Japan, under treaties concluded in 1950s. But Australia, every time concerned about whether U.S. come to help Australia once Australia faces some military contingencies, because Australia is far away from the United States, and Australia is not located in so much strategically important areas. So Australian government judged they need to do more to convince the U.S. government and peoples how Australia is important country for the United States. So what Australia have been doing so far, almost all the war, Australia engaged, all the war, U.S. engaged since Korean War. Of course, Japan cannot do so, but now we need more. Given the changing power, equation, around Japan, we need further effort to make, to convince the U.S. government and peoples how important Japan is for the United States. So I think the recent national security, national defense, the papers and also defense strategies does reflect such Japanese clear recognitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I have a kind of a specific question to each panelist, probably one question for each. First, to Director Thornton, this is about kind of domestic politics and foreign policies, like a linkage of both. It seems that the kind of a willingness to support Ukraine in the United States is pretty solid in terms of the public opinion or in Congress. But some in Japan have a kind of a concern about the prospect of 2024 presidential election. You might see Mr. Trump re-elected or some politician whose national security view is like Mr. Trump, who might say that NATO is obsolete or Japan or Korea should defend themselves. What do you think of the of course, the polarization or instability of U.S. Domestic politics in terms of, from the perspective of foreign observers, and this is my question to you.
Yeah, it's a very hard question and a very good question, and I know a lot of people raised this issue. We went through the Trump administration, of course, and both Japan and Korea, I think, were quite bruised by the experience. Maybe Korea a bit more than Japan, because Abe Shinzo's deft maneuvering with Trump actually, I think, stood Japan in fairly good stead. But I think the real question is about Europe, and the war in Ukraine. I do think that the U.S. is liable to maintain political consensus around supporting Ukraine for some time, but I believe that the support is going to be much tougher in Europe. to sustain a long war, given how much it's affecting European countries. And I think that is a problem for U.S. foreign policy going forward. I think, as far as what's going to happen in 2024, it depends a lot on what happens in 2023, actually, with the war in Ukraine and where we are in 2024. But I think what you will see and what you do hear on the right in the US is a sense that Europe should pay more for its defense. Maybe we can let Europe defend against Russia, whereas the US can turn its sights, as we've been continually trying to do, and pivoting to Asia and taking care of security in Asia more as we sort of offload some of the burden of defending against Russia to Europe. You're not hearing that much right now, but it is a subtext of a lot of Republican sort of foreign policy thinking. And I think if you see a Republican come into the White House in 2024, you're likely to see something more in that direction, probably more, thinking about Europe and offloading some of the burden of security onto the European allies as opposed to Asian allies. I think there's quite a clear consensus that we are need to remain engaged in Asia for quite some time going forward. And this comes from the bipartisan consensus around the competition with China, of course.
Great. Thank you very much. Next, to Ambassador Koskan from the Singaporean perspective. I understand your point that it's not a problem of choosing US or China, but you may have a kind of a wish list for each country, that you want US or China to do these things, if, kind of you wish, US and China like this or like that. What is your kind of request to each country, if you have?
Well, we only have one US and we only have one China, and we'll have to live with them as they are, right? But if I was, say, master of the universe, I can have my own wish, right?
Yeah, imagine.
What I would like for the US is just to remain engaged. Right? And what I would like of China is to understand that its behavior is causing concerns which are not in China's own interests, I believe.
Thank you very much. Professor Mr. Lee Chun-myung, I have a kind of same kind of question to Ms. Thornton. Korean politics have some swings, and the current administration, I understand, is trying to improve the relation with Japan, but the former administration had a bit different attitude to Japan. So, do you think we'll keep seeing this kind of swing every time you have a different administration, or there'll be a kind of some gradual kind of consensus emerging, the new kind of attitude to Japan emerging in your country? Is there kind of a fundamental long-term change you are seeing, or it will be the same Korean kind of domestic politics? What do you think?
Yeah, Korea is exactly. I think Korea is exactly the same as some other countries, including Japan and the U.S. in its domestic. The politics change, and the Korea is a very mature democracy, and many people say that the Korea is one of the most developed countries in terms of democracy. So you can understand in that way the Korean domestic politics. Let me talk about in this context. Let me talk about the Korea-Japan relations. I think both countries should overcome the dynamics of domestic politics in expanding and strengthening the bilateral relations. And the Korea and Japan are really closest neighbors and key partners, which share universal values, including democracy and the free market economy. And the enhanced ties between Korea and Japan are really crucial for strengthening the trilateral cooperation and the peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. And as I already pointed out, that in implementing its new defense policy or security policy, Japan should be a little bit more consistent with its policy against the relations with neighboring countries, including Korea, and that's really crucial. And the most important point is that Korea and Japan should overcome a little bit the dynamics of domestic politics in expanding its bilateral relations. And as I said, the Korean domestic policy is the same as those in other countries, including Japan and the U.S. And thank you.
Okay, great. I have a question to Professor Fang Ximin. This is about Chinese government attitude toward Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. However you define the rule of law or international rules, this must be a kind of blatant violation of international law, whatever you define to me. But it seems that the Chinese government has not criticized Russia for this invasion. Could you explain why? But in this case, how would you define or kind of compromise your definition of international law with what your government has done, attitude toward Russia?
Thank you, President Kubo. On Ukraine, I think, actually in China, if you look at the Chinese social media, public opinions on the war in Ukraine actually are very divided. And there are a lot of different opinions. But I think the Chinese government tries to keep a balance between Kyiv and Moscow. And that left the impression that the Chinese government was more in favor of Russia. My personal understanding, I think like this. From a more realistic perspective, Russia is regarded by many people in China as a strategic asset, especially when China is weighing against the U.S. hegemony. So Russia is a good partner, is a strategic partner for China. And from this realistic point of view, I think the Chinese government is reluctant to criticize Russia so that to keep the potential strategic balance in the general world affairs. So I think that's more a realistic understanding, regarding Russia as a strategic asset. And from a more kind of a moral perspective, I think in China there is a widely accepted view that Russia is a victim of NATO's expansion. NATO's enlargement caused Russians kind of preventive actions. This is, I think, a wide perception in China. And maybe further from that, many people in China are very antipathic. I mean, they are very antipathic to American hostility to China. And then in war in Ukraine, Ukraine is very much backed by the United States and Western countries. And many Chinese people regard the United States as a opponent or adversary of China. So they easily identify themselves to American opponent, which is Russia. So that's these are my personal observation and understanding about the Chinese attitude on war in Ukraine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just a follow-up on your point on the NATO expansion. My understanding is that the Poland or Baltic countries, these countries were never forced from anyone from the United States, for example, to join NATO. They kind of volunteered. They decided as a sovereign country to join NATO. But what do you think of these points? It sounded as if you understood that NATO expansion was kind of something United States or other Western powers kind of forced some countries to do.
Right, I think I totally agree with you. That those Eastern European countries, they joined NATO voluntarily. I totally agree with you. But I think on the other side, the consequence of this enlargement might be understood by people in Russia or in some other countries as a kind of at the cost of other countries' security interest. And that is, I think, the more objective outcome or objective consequences. It's not about the subjective willingness of Poland or Ukraine. I agree with you. They want to join NATO voluntarily, but the objective outcome or consequences might be at the expense of Russia's security or other countries' security interests. So it's about subjective willingness and objective consequences.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry for keep you waiting. Professor Kikuchi, as a specialist of international politics of Southeastern Asia, what kind of further contribution can Japan make in its relation with ASEAN countries? You don't have to mention all ASEAN countries, but you can pick up 2 or 3 or general kind of policy.
Yeah,
might be okay.
yeah. As I mentioned, the strong, national resilience is a basic foundation for regional, peace and stability. And Southeast Asian countries have been enhancing its national governance structures for the last few decades after the decolonizations. So as I mentioned in my presentation, they are now discovering their own, some agencies to play a more active role in, emerging, the new regional, security environment. So almost all the countries in Southeast Asia engage in the massive, defense, build-up, and also, cultivating new security relation, with, outside countries, including United States, Japan, India, and so forth. So I think, continuously Japan should, cooperate with the Southeast Asian countries in their own effort to enhance their own national resilience. And in that context, I would invite your attention to a recent recommendation by national strategic strategies. That is, Japan, introduced a new grant scheme for security cooperation, especially to Southeast Asian countries. Japan mostly, providing non-military, instrument to Southeast Asian countries, especially, some instrument to enhance law enforcement, the capabilities like provision of the Coast Guard ships and so forth. But now, Japan gradually, expanding some military, support to, Southeast Asian countries. I think, the Philippines will be a first case for Japan's, providing some security cooperation grant to, for Southeast Asian countries. That is, still, quite a small step, but it's a quite big change of Japan's engagement in Southeast Asia. I think that is should be further promoted. Thank you.
Okay, we still have 15 minutes or so. So I'd like to pick up some of the questions from the audience. The first one is about ASEAN. So Professor Kikuchi, you were the first in this round. And the question is about, like this, can ASEAN set a platform for reducing tensions? The questioner says that the Indo-Pacific region is heading towards a zero-sum political approach. Would there be an opportunity to establish a non-zero-sum game stand around the ASEAN framework? Can Japan take a more active role in ASEAN? What do you think?
Yeah, a few years ago, ASEAN adopted so-called ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Mostly it's initiative taken by Indonesia. And the main purpose is to change the narrative of Indo-Pacific from rivalry to cooperation. So by implementing this ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, ASEAN countries try to promote some cooperative activities under the name of Indo-Pacific. So we had big expectations. We are looking forward to implement this AOIP. So Japanese government, I think Japan is the first countries strongly committed to implementation of the AOIP. But so far, unfortunately, there are some lack of the lack of effort on the part of ASEAN countries to implement AOIP. And I'm now paying attention how Indonesia, who took initiative to adopt the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. Indonesia is now the ASEAN chairmanship. So I hope Indonesia take some initiative to deactivate the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific and providing some new formula for regional cooperation, including China or United States, Japan, and so forth. Yep.
Okay. On this question, I'd like to invite Director Thornton. What do you think of U.S. approach to ASEAN? Sometimes, of course, the United States is liked and counted in ASEAN countries, but there are some people in ASEAN country who may have some complaint about the United States, like saying that the U.S. might is kind of preaching too much, or economic assistance is a little not big enough compared to what China brings. Japan is probably kind of trusted, liked in ASEAN countries, but we cannot bring military power to this region. What do you think of the U.S. standing in ASEAN countries, and what do you think of the U.S. kind of approach to this area?
It's really hard for the United States as sort of a global leader with global interests to be as attentive to everything and everyone as we would like. So that has been a problem, I think, with respect to ASEAN. And I'm thinking in particular about the attendance of American presidents at the sort of annual ASEAN summits, the EAS summit, et cetera. But I do think that, the U.S. has made a lot of gains in this area in the last couple of years under the Biden administration. And there's always an effort, I think. I mean, under the Obama administration, there was an effort to meet with all of the ASEAN leaders, et cetera. Of course, we stepped up a lot we joined the TAC, et cetera. So there's always more that can be done. I feel like, people are asking a lot of us. When we were when I was in the State Department East Asia Bureau, we traveled, travel to the Pacific Islands, travel to the PIF, travel to ASEAN, a lot of meetings, and it's, diplomatic engagement is really important. I feel that the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Biden administration is frankly overly concentrated in the military and security sphere. I think this has been a common criticism of the approach because there hasn't been a lot of engagement on the economic side. Of course, President Biden didn't go to the APEC summit. So, there are things to criticize, but I think, it's important that people understand that we do as much as we can, and I think it's up to other countries and partners in the region to also be engaged, and that's where I think we really appreciate what Japan's done on the development side in this region, and I think partnerships are the way to go probably in some of these areas.
Okay, thanks. Ambassador Koskan, what is your reaction to Ms. Thornton's remark? And actually, there's a question from a Japanese participant about your remark. You kind of said that Japan should supplement United States in this region, but the participant says that it will be extremely difficult for Japan to do that. What do you think?
Well, let me just respond to Susan's comments. I think you know, Susan, that Singapore has been saying since time immemorial that the US is a vital component of any strategic balance in our region, right? And for the longest time, this was considered by other ASEAN countries as a rather eccentric Singaporean attitude, right? Right now, I think it is becoming, by and large, the mainstream view in ASEAN. Not every ASEAN country is prepared to say so publicly as we are. And for some of them, there are domestic constraints on what they can do with the United States, and that's where Japan can step in, because Japan is a less sensitive partner, but de facto a proxy for the United States in many things. So I think the US position in ASEAN is much better one. The understanding of the strategic role of the US in Southeast Asia is much better now than it was, say, 5-10 years ago. And that's as much due to a failure of Chinese diplomacy as it is to a success of American diplomacy. But of course, you're right, there's always more that can be done. But as I said earlier, there's only one United States, and we'll have to live with you as you are. Now, I don't understand the question from the Japanese participant. Why is it difficult for Japan to do more? I mean, there are legal constraints. Those legal constraints can be modified if necessary. They have already been modified substantially under the second Abe administration. And I think if you take your own national security strategy seriously, and you make your own new defense approach seriously, you will be able to do more, right? So I don't quite understand why Japan is unable to do more. It's a question of political will. I think the political will is there, right? It's a question of necessity. I think the necessity is there. I don't think this is going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in 1 week or 2 weeks, but the trend is in that direction. And I think it is generally a positive trend that by most Southeast Asian countries will welcome.
Thanks. I see one question from a Japanese participant addressed to Professor Fang Ximin, which is like this. How does China view the Quad? In Japan, the Quad is seen as a forum to deter China. But do you think China is under pressure or deterred by the Quad? What do you think?
Okay, thank you. I think in my presentation, I mentioned a little bit already about how the Quad is understood in China. I think if the Quad is seen as an emerging security bloc, which is exclusive in the Asia-Pacific region, and then that be very dividing and destructive especially for China. But I note that in many statements from the Quad countries, they said they want to keep the Indo-Pacific region as a free and open region. I think if the Quad is more a open framework, which maybe in the future can be more inclusive and then that be more constructive. So I think it depends on how Quad countries regard themselves. If the Quad is only seen as targeting at China, and then of course it would be very destructive and dividing and cause new escalations of tension and conflict in our region, and that is very destructive. So that's, I think, my response to the perception on Quad in China.
Okay. And I'm getting one question on U.S.-China relations. This might be the last question I can take, which is about competition versus cooperation. And it is almost a kind of a cliche for high-ranking U.S. officials to say that there is a competition element as well as a cooperation element in U.S.-China relations. And but what about the cooperation? Is there any actual cooperation on kind of action programs, areas, could you name one that is working in terms of the cooperation between the two countries? Or could you kind of point out promising areas for cooperation between US and Japan, Dr. Thornton and Professor Fan Ximing?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think it's true that China and the United States governments cooperate less and less in the past decade. Actually, on many non-traditional security issues, we expect that the two governments could cooperate. For example, on public health to control the pandemic, and on climate change, and these less political areas. But unfortunately, even in the area of public health on the pandemic control, it becomes a point of clash between the two governments. So in my current observation, the only possible cooperation and the feasible area for cooperation might be still climate change. I think still two governments are talking about the cooperation on climate change and the environment and etc. But I think we can start from there, and then there should be more communications and exchanges between the two, not only between two governments, but also between the two peoples. As we mentioned, there has been declining communication and exchanges between the two countries. So I think from better communication, maybe we can find some new point of cooperation. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Thornton, what is your thought on this?
Well, I'm very glad that the questioner asked this question because I think it's crucially important for every country in the region to focus on this. There is very little cooperation right now, but it is imperative that the US and China be able to balance their competition with cooperation. It's a very important part of the narrative, because if we only have the narrative focused on competition or confrontation, the relationship will continue to spiral downward with very, very catastrophic consequences, I'm afraid. So it's unfortunately, as Professor Fan has said, there's almost no cooperation, there's no diplomacy, there are no, frankly, private conversations happening right now. No plans, I don't think, for Secretary Blinken now to go to China. So this is a very dire situation between these two huge powers. And I think it's very important for countries in the region to encourage both countries to not only say the word cooperation, but to actually engage in diplomacy and to make the cooperation apparent to all so that we can balance the relationship to some extent. There's obviously so many areas. We haven't even really talked about North Korea in this conversation, but this is a topic that always comes up that should be an area for cooperation. We have the same interests in preventing the further development of North Korea's nuclear program and the same interest in denuclearization, and we haven't been able to get on the same page even on that issue. And as Professor Fan mentioned, public health, environment, climate change are all areas where if we're two mature, responsible countries, we ought to be able to find common ground, and it's just not working right now.
Okay, great. We are running out of time. Ukraine and Japan are far apart geographically, but we have two things in common. One, Russia as a neighbor, and second, part of territories are illegally occupied by Russia. So, and for Japan, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an outright breach of international norm based on the rule of law. So we tend to think that Russia's attempt must fail. It is very fortunate at this kind of historical juncture for us to get together and discuss issues, some of which are certainly difficult, but naturally and inevitably differences remain. But thank you very much for your very candid opinion, and thank you for your participation. I wrap up the session. Thank you very much.